The North Atlantic in March 1943 was a freezing, heaving darkness. Convoy HX-229, 41 merchant ships heavy with the cargo a nation needed to survive, pushed through the swells. Deep in the galley of the SS William Eustis, a 28-year-old cook named Tommy Lawson wrestled with pots and pans as the ship rolled violently. He was just a man doing a job, far removed from the war's grand strategies. Above him, on the bridge, Captain James Bannerman scanned the horizon with binoculars, his stomach tight with a fear he couldn't shake. He knew they were being hunted. Somewhere in the black water below, the U-boats were listening. And he was right. Just 600 yards off the convoy's port side, inside U-758, the hunter's crew was at work. A young operator pressed his headphones tight to his ears, whispering into the silence. Contact, multiple propellers, heavy machinery, maybe 40 ships. His commander allowed himself a thin smile. The wolf pack had found its prey. What none of them knew, not the anxious British captain, not the confident German commander, was that the man who would break this deadly stalemate was currently elbow-deep in soapy water. Tommy Lawson, the cook, had noticed something strange about the way ships sounded underwater. It was an observation that would change everything. In the 6 days that followed, the ocean swallowed 22 merchant ships from convoys HX-229 and SC-122, taking hundreds of men with them. It was one of the worst disasters of the war at sea. In London, the numbers told a terrifying story. That March, U-boats had sunk over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping. Britain was being starved into surrender. The country's leader, Winston Churchill, would later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him. The problem was simple and terrifying. The convoys were just too loud. German submarines could hear the roar of their propellers and machinery from dozens of miles away. Each ship was like a ringing bell, announcing its position. The Navy had tried everything: zigzag patterns, radio silence, new detection gear. Nothing worked. The U-boats would simply sit silently in the deep, listen for the noise, and glide into the perfect position to attack. In the command centers, the experts had reached a grim conclusion. "You cannot make a merchant ship quiet enough to hide," one senior architect declared. The only solution, they argued, was a complete redesign of every ship, an impossible task while the war raged. The situation was desperate. The battle for the Atlantic was being lost. But while admirals and scientists despaired, Tommy Lawson was thinking. He had developed a strange habit during his time off. He would go and sit in the ship's engine room. His crewmates thought he was crazy. The space was deafeningly loud and blisteringly hot. Yet Lawson sat there, listening. During one U-boat alert, as the crew braced for impact, a torpedo struck a ship 2 columns over. Through the hull, Lawson heard it, not just the explosion, but what came after. The water rushing into the dying ship created a strange, hollow, booming sound. And then, suddenly, there was silence. The ship, which had been a beacon of noise, had gone quiet. He turned to the ship's engineer, a gruff man named Donald MacLeod. "The sinking ship," Lawson said, struggling to be heard over the din. "It stopped making noise." "Of course it stopped," MacLeod yelled back. "It's full of water." "No, I mean, the U-boat can't hear it anymore," Lawson insisted. "The water is stopping the vibrations. What if we could flood parts of our ship on purpose? Not enough to sink us, just enough to silence the noise." McLeod stared at him, his expression shifting from confusion to contempt. "That's the most stupid thing I've ever heard," he said. "Get back to your galley." No one took the cook seriously, but Lawson couldn't let the idea go. In a small notebook, he began to sketch his thoughts. Chambers of water around the propeller shaft, bladders positioned against the engine mounts. He showed his drawings to the officers. They were dismissed as the ramblings of a man who belonged in the kitchen. He was just a cook, after all. Nobody expected a world-changing idea from the man who made their breakfast. Frustrated but undeterred, Tommy Lawson made a decision that could end his career. When the William Eustace docked in Liverpool, he had 48 hours of shore leave. Instead of finding a pub, he walked straight into the imposing headquarters of Western Approaches Command, the nerve center of the British Atlantic War. He asked to speak to an admiral about U-boats. Unsurprisingly, he didn't get an admiral. He got arrested. 2 Royal Navy patrol officers intercepted him in the lobby. "You can't be here, mate," one said, grabbing his arm. "This is a restricted military facility." "I need to talk to someone about the convoy noise," Lawson insisted, his American accent standing out. "I have an idea." "Everyone's got ideas, Yank. Clear off." They were escorting him out when a voice cut across the marble lobby. "Wait!" The speaker was Commander Peter Gretton, a young Royal Navy officer who had just returned from a convoy where he had lost 13 merchant ships to a wolf pack. He was exhausted, angry, and desperate for any advantage, any new idea, no matter how small. The exchange had caught his attention. "What did you say about convoy noise?" Gretton asked. Lawson seized his chance. He explained his observation, the sinking ship going silent, the way the water seemed to swallow the vibrations. He talked about his idea of using controlled flooding, not to sink a ship, but to silence it. Gretton listened, arms crossed, his face a mask of skepticism. When Lawson finished, the commander said flatly, "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard this month. Water inside a ship is called sinking." "Not if you control it," Lawson argued, his voice steadying. "Small chambers positioned right against the machinery. You're not flooding the ship, you're creating a barrier." Gretton was about to dismiss him for good when a single phrase Lawson used made him pause. "A barrier," he repeated. "An acoustic barrier," Lawson said. "Water absorbs vibration better than air or steel. If you put it in the right places, the sound can't get out to the ocean." Gretton's expression shifted. The idea was still insane, but it was a specific, physical kind of insane. It was something that could be tested. In his desperation, he saw a glimmer of something he hadn't seen in the polished briefings of the admirals. A new angle. "Come with me," Gretton said. 3 days later, they stood in a dry dock in Liverpool, looking at the hull of the corvette HMS Sunflower. Gretton had pulled every string he had. "If this works," he told Lawson, "and that's a massive if, we test it here. Small scale. No one needs to know." Over the next 72 hours, they worked in secret. With the ship's engineer, a skeptical lieutenant named James Whitby, they jury-rigged a prototype. They welded empty oil drums around the corvette's propeller shaft and filled them with seawater. They positioned sandbags to simulate the weight against the engine mounts. It was crude, ugly, and completely against every regulation in the Royal Navy. The day of the test, the Sunflower motored out into the River Mersey. A friendly submarine, HMS Trespasser, played the role of the U-boat, submerged 500 yards away with its listening gear active. Lawson stood on the deck, holding his breath. This was the moment of truth. The Trespasser surfaced and signaled. The message was a failure. "Heard you clear as day. Engine noise, propeller noise, same as always." "Told you it was bloody stupid," Whitby muttered. But Lawson was watching the drums. "They're not full," he said, pointing. "We filled them in dry dock. The water drained out through the seams. We need to seal them, make them watertight." Gretton ran a hand through his hair, imagining the court-martial that awaited him if they were caught modifying a warship without permission. He looked at Lawson, whose face was set with a determination that belied his station. "If the Admiralty finds out U-boats are sinking 20 ships a week because we were too proud to test a cook's idea," Lawson said quietly, "then we lose the war." Gretton made his choice. 3 more days, he said. Then this experiment ends. They worked around the clock, welding sealed steel chambers and adding water-filled rubber bladders. They weren't just patching holes anymore. They were building a system. On April 2nd, 1943, they tried again. This time, the Sunflower ran at full speed. The trespasser submerged 1,000 yards away. Minutes passed, then more minutes. There was no signal. Finally, the submarine surfaced. Its captain's report was brief and earth-shattering. "We lost you at 400 yards. The hydrophones picked up nothing but the ocean. Whatever you did to that ship, it works." On the deck of the Sunflower, Lawson closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. It worked. They had just made a warship disappear. Commander Gretton didn't hesitate. He immediately requested an emergency meeting with Rear Admiral Max Horton, the formidable commander-in-chief of Western approaches. He brought Lawson with him, a move that caused visible horror among the Admiral's staff. A merchant cook, in the inner sanctum of naval power. The boardroom was filled with senior officers and the very experts who had declared the problem unsolvable. Dr. Harold Burris, the chief naval architect, was there, his expression one of profound skepticism. Gretton presented the test results. The detection range had been slashed from 12 miles to just 400 yards. A 97% reduction in the ship's acoustic signature. The room erupted. "This is preposterous," Dr. Burris snapped. "You've conducted unauthorized modifications to a Royal Navy vessel based on the suggestion of forgive me, a cook. A cook who understands this better than your entire department," Gretton fired back, the tension crackling in the air. Admiral Horton, a legendary submariner from the previous war, raised a hand for silence. His eyes, cold and assessing, turned to Lawson. "Explain it to me simply," he commanded. Lawson stood, acutely aware of his own insignificance in that room. "Sir," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Ship machinery creates vibration. That vibration travels through the hull and into the water where the enemy can hear it. Water absorbs vibration better than air or steel. If you position sealed chambers of it against the machinery and the propeller shafts, you create a barrier. The sound never reaches the ocean." "It violates basic principles," Dr. Burris insisted, citing weight and stability issues. "Water in sealed chambers," Lawson corrected. "Positioned for silencing, not for sinking. And we tested it. It works." "One test," Burris scoffed. "In a river, hardly conclusive." The debate raged until Horton stood, bringing everyone to their feet. He walked to the window, staring out at the city. Finally, he turned. The fate of the Atlantic campaign hung on his next words. "Commander Gretton," Horton said, his voice low and decisive. "You will retrofit 6 merchant ships from Convoy ON 184. They depart in 8 days. Mr. Lawson, you will supervise the installation. Dr. Burris, you will provide technical support, even if you think this is insane." He fixed his gaze on Lawson. "If it works, we implement it across the entire fleet. If it fails, Commander Gretton will spend the rest of the war commanding a minesweeper in the Orkney Islands. Clear?" The gamble was on. April 22, 1943. Mid-Atlantic. Convoy ON 184 was at sea. The 6 modified ships were scattered throughout the formation. No one had told the convoy commander. This was a trial under fire. Aboard U-264, Captain Lieutenant Hartwig Lux studied his charts, frustrated. His hydrophone operator was confused. "Contact is weakening, sir. The signal is intermittent. Some ships are very loud, others almost silent." Lux frowned. That was impossible. You either heard a convoy or you didn't. He ordered the U-boat to periscope depth. Through the lens, he could see the convoy, a forest of masts and hulls. But his ears were telling a different story. His hydrophones should have been deafened by the noise of 43 ships. Instead, he could only clearly hear 27. 16 were ghosts. He made a decision that would save countless Allied lives. He targeted only the ships he could hear clearly. The 6 modified vessels, quieter than the ocean around them, slipped past the wolf pack undetected. Over the next 18 hours, the U-boats sank 9 merchant ships. It was a brutal loss. But of those 9, 0 were the modified ships. The 6 with Lawson's system survived untouched. When the news reached London, the effect was electric. The proof was undeniable. Gretton's signal was succinct. Acoustic dampening effective under combat conditions. Recommend immediate fleet-wide implementation. The tide of the Atlantic battle had begun to turn, not because of a grand technological marvel, but because a cook had noticed the silence within a sinking ship and dared to speak up. The success of Convoy ON 184 was not a fluke. It was a blueprint. The evidence was too compelling to ignore. Within days of Commander Gretton's report landing on Admiral Horton's desk, a massive, top-priority operation was set in motion. The simple system of sealed water chambers, once dismissed as a plumber's nightmare, was now the Allies' most closely guarded secret weapon. The implementation was a feat of sheer will. Dockyards from Liverpool to New York worked around the clock. The process was refined and accelerated. What had taken 3 days on the HMS Sunflower was now whittled down to just 48 hours per merchant ship. The cost was a fraction of building a new vessel. The system was so straightforward that any dockyard crew could install it, and any ship's engineer could maintain it. They weren't building complex new machines. They were simply teaching old ones how to be quiet. By July 1943, the ocean itself seemed to change for the German U-boat crews. Where once the hydrophones had screamed with the thunder of approaching convoys, now there was an unnerving silence, broken only by intermittent and confusing sound signatures. A captured German hydrophone operator from the sunk U-954 confessed to his British interrogators, his voice still laced with bewilderment. "We could not understand what was happening. Sometimes we heard convoy sounds from a great distance. Other times, ships were practically on top of us before we detected them. It was as if the ocean had become silent. The hunters had become the hunted. The statistics told the definitive story. Before the widespread use of the dampening system, the average U-boat could detect a convoy from over 11 miles away. After, less than half a mile. This single change shattered the wolf pack tactic. Submarines could no longer coordinate attacks on targets they couldn't collectively hear. To find the convoys, they were forced to come closer, to venture into the deadly range of Allied radar, sonar, and the vigilant eyes of escort ships and aircraft. May 1943 went down in German naval history as Black May. The tables had turned with devastating speed. Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, a staggering 25% of Germany's operational submarine fleet. In return, they lost only 58 merchant ships, a dramatic drop from the 96 lost in March. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz, the mastermind of the U-boat campaign, wrote in his war diary with grim finality, "The enemy has robbed the U-boats of their most effective weapon, the surprise attack from the deep. The old certainties have vanished." The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the relentless, bleeding losses that had brought Britain to the brink were over. The lifeline across the ocean was secure. The genius of the solution was its simplicity. It had not come from a laboratory, but from a galley. It was not built with rare materials, but with steel, rubber, and seawater. And the man who conceived it sought no glory for it. After the war, Thomas Patrick Lawson returned to Boston. He received a quiet medal in a quiet ceremony and refused all interviews. When the New York Times asked for his story in 1947, he declined, saying, "I just noticed something and mentioned it. Other people did the real work." He opened a small diner, married, and raised a family. His obituary in 1991 described him only as a retired restaurant owner and merchant marine veteran. It made no mention of the thousands of lives he saved or the naval warfare he revolutionized. But at his funeral, 3 elderly British naval officers attended, men who had served on convoy escorts in 1943. They had survived because the U-boats could no longer hear their ships coming. One of them stepped forward and placed a simple, folded note into Lawson's casket. It read, "Because of you, we came home." After the war, the world moved on. The great fleets were disbanded, and the heroes who stood on bridges and commanded ships were celebrated. Thomas "Tommy" Lawson collected his British Empire medal at a small, quiet ceremony in London. He refused all interviews and returned to Boston, a place eager to forget the war and embrace the future. He used his savings to open Lawson's Diner, a small, unassuming place in Dorchester. The regulars knew him as a quiet man, a former merchant sailor who made a good breakfast and kept to himself. His wife knew he had served, and that was all. The secret of what he had done was locked away, not out of shame, but out of a profound sense that he didn't deserve the spotlight. "I just noticed something and mentioned it," he told a persistent reporter from the New York Times in 1947, before politely ending the conversation. Other people did the real work. For decades, the true story was known only to a handful of naval historians and the men whose lives his idea had saved. His obituary in the Boston Globe in 1991 was brief: a retired restaurant owner and merchant marine veteran. There was no mention of silent convoys or turned tides. But at his funeral, 3 elderly men, their postures still hinting at a military bearing, attended. They were British, and they had traveled a long way. They had served as young officers on escort vessels in the spring of 1943. One of them, his voice thick with emotion, approached the casket and placed a single folded note inside. It read, "Because of you, we came home." That simple message was his true epitaph. It spoke of the families that remained whole, the children who knew their fathers, the lives lived because a cook had the courage to see what everyone else had overlooked. The principle he sketched in his notebook didn't die with him. It evolved. The simple water-filled chambers gave way to more advanced systems that used curtains of bubbles to mask a ship's sound, a direct descendant of his original idea. Today, nearly every major warship in the world uses a version of this technology, a silent tribute to the man in the galley. The U.S. Naval Academy eventually added his story to its curriculum, not as a lesson in engineering, but as a lesson in leadership. They teach cadets that the most dangerous phrase in any conflict is not, "That's impossible," but, "We've always done it this way." Lawson's legacy is a permanent reminder that brilliance isn't about credentials, it's about perspective. It's about the willingness to listen to the quietest voice in the room, and to understand that sometimes the solution to the most complex problem isn't more noise, but the courage to create silence. The story of Tommy Lawson did not end at his graveside. In the years following his funeral, the quiet legend of the cook who saved the convoys began to slowly seep into public consciousness. A British naval historian, digging through declassified Admiralty files in the late 1990s, pieced together the full narrative. He tracked down Lawson's now-adult children, who had only known their father as a humble diner owner, a man who would sometimes stare silently at the ocean when they visited the beach. The historian's book, The Silent Solution, while not a bestseller, found its way into the hands of military strategists and corporate leaders. They were less interested in the technical details and more captivated by the parable of innovation it represented. Here was a case study that proved a multi-million-dollar problem could be solved not by throwing more money or more experts at it, but by empowering a fresh pair of eyes. In Lawson's old neighborhood in Boston, a small plaque was eventually placed outside the now-closed Lawson's Diner. It reads, "Here stood the diner of Thomas P. Lawson, whose simple observation changed the course of World War II. A reminder that heroes are among us, often unnoticed. Local school teachers now bring their classes there, telling the story of the cook who taught the Navy how to listen." The most profound legacy, however, remains in the deep ocean. The modern systems that hide today's warships from enemy listening devices are direct technological grandchildren of Lawson's water-filled drums. Engineers who work on these complex systems learn about their origin story, a story that begins not in a lab, but in a sinking ship's final, telling silence. And so, the echo of Tommy Lawson's idea persists. It's in the quiet hum of a naval vessel shielded from detection. It's in the business seminars that teach the Lawson principle, the value of seeking diverse perspectives when facing a seemingly impossible challenge. It's in the quiet pride of his grandchildren, who finally understood the depth of their grandfather's quiet humility. His story is a permanent testament to a powerful truth, that the weight of a single observation, when paired with unwavering conviction, can be heavier than the mightiest battleship, and that the quietest voices can sometimes silence the thunder of war itself. The story of Tommy Lawson's quiet revolution did not fade with time. Instead, it grew into a quiet legend, a story told in places where people understood that courage comes in many forms. At the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, the Lawson case study became a foundational part of the leadership curriculum. Midshipmen were presented with the facts, a seemingly insurmountable tactical problem, a string of failed multi-million-dollar solutions, and a lone, uncredentialed cook with a notebook. Their task was not to design a better acoustic chamber, but to answer a more difficult question. How do you create a system where the next Tommy Lawson will be heard? The lesson was clear. True leadership involves cultivating the humility to listen, especially to those from outside the established hierarchy. The principle even found its way into the unlikeliest of places, corporate boardrooms and Silicon Valley innovation workshops. Management consultants coined the term the Lawson principle, which argued that the most transformative ideas often come from the edges of an organization, from those who see the process with fresh eyes, unburdened by the way things have always been done. They used his story to champion cross-functional teams and to warn against the dangers of expert blind spots. Back in Liverpool, where the desperate experiment had begun, the story took on a life of its own. In a pub near the old docks, favored by retired mariners, a toast would occasionally be raised. To the Yankee cook. It was a toast understood by the old-timers, a tribute not just to a man, but to the idea that in the darkest hour, salvation could come from the most humble quarter. The ultimate tribute, however, remains operational. Every time a modern U.S. Navy destroyer activates its advanced acoustic silencing system, it is enacting the core principle Lawson discovered, using a barrier of water or air to break up the sound signature. The technology has been refined beyond his imagination, but the soul of the innovation remains his. Engineers who work on these systems know the name Thomas Lawson, not as a distant historical figure, but as the spiritual father of their field. His family, once completely in the dark, now safeguards his memory with a quiet pride. They keep the few artifacts he left behind: the faded British Empire medal, a photograph of him standing on the deck of the William Eustace, and a single, yellowed page from the notebook where he first sketched his idea. They don't speak of him as a war hero, but as a man who saw a problem and, against all odds, quietly insisted on fixing it. Tommy Lawson's legacy is not carved on grand monuments. It is woven into the fabric of how we solve problems. It is a permanent reminder that the distance between catastrophe and salvation can be bridged by a single, observant mind, and that the courage to speak a simple, truthful idea into the face of entrenched authority is one of the most powerful forces in the world. The ripples from the silence he created continue to spread, forever changing how we think about innovation, leadership, and the quiet power of paying attention.